Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our In Conversation event. It's being held by the History and Heritage theme. My name is Rochelle Mead, and I lead the theme here in the School of Modern Languages. So I'm very pleased that you have come to join us today. Today we will be speaking with three members of the School of Modern Languages staff who have research interests that intersect and who have actually come together to do a research-led module. So they are Dr. Charlotte Hammond, who is lecturer in French, Dr. Jenny Nelson, who is lecturer in Portuguese, and Jesús Sanjurjo, who is lecturer in Hispanic and Latin American studies. So thank you very much for joining us today. Some quick housekeeping. The session is being recorded, as you have all hopefully accepted so far. If you want to ask any questions today, this is an informal chat. We're hoping that it stays quite informal. So if you have any questions at any point, please feel free to use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of the screen. Once you type in your question, we see it, all the panelists see it. Other attendees also see your question, and you can upvote any of these questions. And so that kind of sends it to the top of the ranking, so to speak, so we can give that priority. You can also raise your hand, and that will let me know that you want to ask your question in person. I can invite you to give your question verbally to our panelists. So without much further ado, we'll get started. I'll invite each of our speakers to tell us a little bit about themselves and their research. So shall we start with you, Charlotte?
Hey, thanks very much, Lisa. Thanks for organising this, and thanks to Lal as well for all their work behind the scenes. I guess I work broadly within Caribbean cultural studies, within Haitian studies more specifically. I'm currently working on a project based on a recent Leverhulme Fellowship, looking at how women, garment and textile workers in Haiti and the Dominican Republic navigate and resist exploitative labour conditions and global economic structures. So I look at the secondhand clothing trade, factory garment work in export processing zones, and also a critical look at international ethical fashion initiatives. Just before that, my previous project, so my doctoral research explored the dynamics of cross-dressing and gender performance in the cultures of Martinique, Guadeloupe and Haiti, and how it looked at how the opacity of crossing, mimicry and masquerade becomes an ongoing means of resistance to colonial classifications, so racialized, gendered and patriarchal classifications of enslaved and free people of colour, both during slavery and its aftermath. So that project has focused on cross-dressing and how that kind of entangles colonial binaries of identity. And I was looking at work within works of art, film, photography, carnival performance, and also dress. So that was my first book, which was published in 2018 with Liverpool University Press, entitled Entangled Otherness, Cross-Gender Fabrications in the Francophone Caribbean. So I guess what connects these projects is probably histories of exclusion and labour extraction. So in the sense of contemporary iterations of the colonial plantation, whether that be foreign-owned garment factories or Caribbean hotel complexes. And I recently co-wrote an article about white women tourists travelling to Haiti for sex, and how post-colonial scholars risk reenacting the uneven power dynamics that are being studied and exposed. So I'll stop there for a moment.
Thank you very much. A lot in there that I'm sure we'll be able to pick up on and discuss during the session. Just a reminder, if you have any questions to Charlotte, please do use the Q&A function or raise your hand. Okay, let's move on to Jenny. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you have been working on?
Okay, hi, I'm Jenny and I'm a lecturer in Portuguese and Lusophone Studies here in Cardiff. And I work on the study of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade in Brazil principally, but also a little bit I focus on comparative studies of Brazil and Cuba and British anti-slavery in Brazil and Cuba, the involvement of British abolitionists and British anti-slavery campaigning in Brazil and Cuba in the 19th century. And I'm currently writing an article that fits within the sort of transatlantic framework and relates well to some of the themes that we're drawing on for the module that we're currently teaching together. It looks at case studies of two groups of freed Africans who were enslaved in Havana in the mid-19th century, and they made return voyages to Lagos via Southampton and Plymouth in 1854 and 1855. Looking at the kind of specific circumstances of those voyages, what made them possible, and the documentation surrounding the two groups of Africans and the time they spent in England in particular, including the diary of a Quaker abolitionist who met some of them in Plymouth. I'm looking at bigger questions about the nature of freedom and voluntary and involuntary transnational migration through that article.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, Jesús, do you want to tell us about yourself and what you're working on, please?
Thank you, Rochelle, for organizing this. So yeah, I'm Jesús. I'm lecturer in Hispanic and Latin American Studies here at Cardiff, and I have recently published two articles. One looking at the construction of democratizing discourses or democratic ideas, and how that was linked to the emergence of anti-slavery discourses and political speeches in Spain through the 19th century. And I've also co-edited a special issue on the comparative study of the forms of unfree labor in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean, together with Professor Manuel Barcia. In the next few months, my first book will be out, In the Blood of Our Brothers, The Abolition of the Slave Trade in Spain's Atlantic Empire. And this book is based on my doctoral research. So I've been working on it for a few years now. And it looks at the history of the anti-slavery movement in Spain. And it kind of brings and connects the history of abolitionism in the Spanish Empire with the very rich traditional historiographies of anti-slavery studies in Britain, France, the United States, and Latin America. So in a way, my book tries to be a continuation of a foundational work by David Murray, Audius Commerce, who recently passed away. And the idea of the project is to actually bring some missing voices into that conversation. So the voices of enslaved people in Spanish Caribbean territories, but also the voices of the Spanish anti-slavery activists and anti-slavery politicians. And I think that ultimately the idea of this project and the other projects that I've been working on is to bring the history of the Spanish Empire and to put that in conversation with the contribution that other colleagues have been doing for the history of other European territories and other European colonial spaces and the history of slavery and the slave trade.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jesús. Maybe I can get you to expand a bit more. You spoke a bit about the sort of the contribution your work is making to transnational understanding, or how the transnational helps our understanding of the emancipation movement. Do you want to maybe expand a bit more on the Spanish case and what exactly it does add to our understanding of the emancipation movement?
Absolutely, and I think
abolition movement. Sorry.
That's something I think that both Charlotte, Jenny, and myself, and we're all doing in a way, is that we're looking at building a history of the slavery and the slave trade and the legacies of the slavery and the slave trade by distancing ourselves and breaking with traditional colonial and national barriers and ways of understanding the past. I think that both the transnational perspective, and this means looking at historical episodes not through the eyes of the nation or the eyes of the state, but actually through the eyes of the people who are involved in this episode, has been a fundamental way in the way that I've built my book and my research. Just to give you an example, one of the most fascinating aspects of the history of the Caribbean, it's how fluid and how quick ideas spread around, not just because of the geographical proximity, but also because of the enormous mobility that the historical agents and the historical characters that during the 19th century are having around this territory. So to try to think of the history of a movement or the history of an idea only through the lenses of a certain nation or a certain colony or a certain territory, it just doesn't make sense, because ideas travel a lot faster and a lot farther than people. So by looking at how these ideas operate in different territories and colonial entities in colonial spaces, we can actually trace the history of those ideas in a much more comprehensive and successful way that if we look at the history of anti-slavery movement in Spain, in France, or in the United States. It's much more interesting, productive, and also revealing to look at how, for example, the history of the idea that owning other human beings was outrageous starts to spread from various different points in the Atlantic world, but ends up interacting with each other, transforming each other, and informing each other. And I think that one of the most important conclusions of my book is that we cannot think about the history of the anti-slavery movement without fully comprehending the history of the anti-slavery movements of other parts in the Atlantic world.
Thank you. And yeah, this is something that you do in your module, which we'll be discussing soon. I'd like to get Jenny to expand a bit on a really fascinating article that you wrote in, I think it was Atlantic Studies in 2017 about HMS Romney. Can you please introduce HMS Romney to us and its significance? This was a really interesting episode that I was not aware about and was, really wanted to learn more when I read your article. So yeah, please, if you can let us know a bit about what the ship is and how it fits into this whole story of abolition and emancipation.
Thank you, Roselle. So the HMS Romney was actually a holding ship that was a former, it was a British ship that was stationed off the coast of Cuba in the 1840s, and it was the purpose of the ship was to take on board enslaved Africans who had arrived in Cuba illegally, and they were going to be there was a process, there was a court that was set up according to bilateral anti-slave trade treaties between Spain and Britain. This court existed in Havana, and there were several courts all around the Atlantic world, in several Atlantic port cities, that were based on these bilateral treaties, and they were pretty unwelcome, as you might imagine, and it was kind of seen as an imposition of British law. The enslaved people who arrived at that time were continually being illegally enslaved. But if the ship had been that they arrived on had been intercepted by anti-slavery patrols, then they might end up in this position of possibly being freed and apprenticed for a certain period of time. Like it was a kind of an indentured period of indentured labour for around 14 years. Those enslaved people were being held on this ship to protect them from slavery, from being forced into slavery in Cuba. What I think is really interesting about this ship is that it kind of challenges the racial hierarchy that existed in Cuba, because we have a regiment of black soldiers on the ship who were in a position of authority to a certain extent, and this was seen as kind of disrupting the the hierarchy that existed in Cuba at that time, and they go ashore at several points in time and cause a certain amount of disturbance, of upsetting the kind of the social structure a little bit, and they encounter enslaved people, and yeah, it's kind of seen as a little bit. It's seen as outrageous by the Spanish colonial authorities, basically. And I think it's really interesting, connecting onto what Jesús was saying, the possibility of the spread of ideas in this way, and of Atlantic actors. I'm really fascinated by the possibilities that come about through the Atlantic histories of people, unexpected people who move around the Caribbean, and who move around more broadly across the Atlantic world, and have the possibility to spread knowledge and ideas.
One thing I found quite interesting, and which might be interesting to other people working in a school of modern languages, was the role of some of the liberated Africans as interpreters. Can you say a bit more about the role that they played as interpreters?
Okay.
Sorry, just threw that one at you, but
so there's a certain recognition that that enslaved people who were arriving spoke many different languages, and that it was really important to correctly register everybody who was arriving, and get some sort of basic information that would enable the British authorities to trace them, and to make sure that they wouldn't be enslaved at any point. So I guess that was the idea behind using interpreters to interview the Africans who are arriving, and preserve that record of information about them. But there's very little information that was actually written down. So it's the very basic information about their background and their names, and a brief description as well.
Sorry for throwing that at you, just out of the blue. Charlotte, can you tell us a bit more about your more recent work, especially as it relates to the impact of COVID on garment workers, women workers in Haiti, and how perhaps what's happening with, well, if you maybe can tell us a bit more about how it has impacted female garment workers in Haiti, and some possible directions for your research from the pandemic.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question, Michelle. I think, well, firstly, the COVID's had a huge impact on the global fashion industry. In that first, the first half of 2020, there were orders being cancelled. A complete sort of it kind of ground to a halt at the top end of the global supply chain, but at the bottom end of the global supply chain, we have the factories, for example, that I work with in northern Haiti, and we were getting reports from the unions there describing how as production started to start up again, how workers were being forced back to work when the security conditions weren't in place to protect the workers, when they didn't have the necessary protective equipment to ensure their safety. And these are already, in these factories, the conditions are already dire. These are sweatshop conditions. And so workers were forced back to work and were beginning to produce PPE to export to North America, in the case of Haiti, while at the same time shipments of medical equipment and healthcare supplies were being intercepted by the Trump administration. So you've got, I guess, here to relate to previous conversation, you've got all these kind of goods that are moving quite well, in some cases quite freely around, but there's also the question of who gets to stay still, who gets to move. If we look at the workers themselves, yeah, so I think in terms of research, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'm kind of thinking what I can do now beyond academia in a way. How can I do more? And actually thinking maybe translation work is the most helpful thing that I can bring to the kind of campaigns that are ongoing. Yeah. So.
Can you say a bit more about that, the translation work, how that might help? What would need to be translated and under what circumstances, where, and how would that, yeah, what contribution could translation make?
Yeah, I think in my research so far with that project, I've been kind of trying to collect worker narratives. But I also wonder whether more needs to be done in terms of kind of making the connection to the top end of the supply chain, and you know, not only just putting pressure on the suppliers, but also the brands, and how we can make, there's such a huge disconnect between workers in the global south and the brands in the global north, and how these kind of, the message can be translated, if you like, to reach a wider audience, and to make some kind of impact on how brands are operating. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think we might speak a bit more about that when we discuss the Arts and Heritage Anti-Slavery Arts and Heritage Network. I'd like to move on to the module that you're working on. So you've come together to do a research-led module that brings together your work. I don't know who wants to do this, but can you give a short introduction to the module? What level is it? Who is it aimed at? What type of texts do you look at? Yes, if you can give us a brief introduction, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take this one. So it's a final year module. And I guess the idea for the module is called Slavery, Abolitionism and the Black Atlantic, a Transnational Perspective. The idea for it kind of sprang up quite organically, and we saw it as an opportunity to capitalise on our similar research interests, and as a possible way of starting a kind of research cluster that might stimulate further collaboration. The groundwork in some respects has been done in MLang because of the transnational focus on some of the modules that are taught in years 1 and 2, with a sort of emphasis and introduction to the transnational framework. But I think as a group, we are really keenly aware of the disconnect between the historiography on different geographically defined areas, and of the benefits of overcoming colonial barriers, and also of collaborative approaches. So the module's influenced by our recent research, and also teaching that we've carried out in the past, that speaks to campaigns such as decolonising the curriculum, and why is my curriculum so white, and really examining the history and ongoing legacies of colonial slavery and racism. So for instance, this semester I'm looking at urban slavery and resistance, and I think resistance is a theme that we're all going to be really delving into and emphasizing as absolutely essential to the study of slavery. I'm also looking at slave narratives and their potential as a resource that represents the voices of enslaved people, and talking a lot about the challenges of finding sources that do represent, that we can use to represent the voices of the enslaved. And then in the second semester, we're looking much more at the legacies of slavery, but I think always focusing on our particular area of expertise, but also trying to demonstrate the connections that we can draw between each of our respective areas of study. And I think on that note, perhaps what would really enhance the module would be a specialist as well on West Africa. So perhaps Jesús or Charlotte would like to talk about what they're teaching.
Shall I go?
Okay.
So I think that, you know, one of the things that I was very keen to do in this new module, and that, you know, perhaps I didn't had the freedom to do it in the teaching that I have done on slavery and slavery in the past, was the possibility of really dedicating a whole block of the module to look at abolition of the slave trade and emancipation on its own, and really challenge this idea, or this very Anglo-centric preconception of the so-called era of abolition. So in 1807, Britain decides to abolish the slave trade, and in 1833, the British Parliament puts an official end to slavery in its colonial territories, and that is, you know, has been traditionally defined by most of the Anglophone historiography as the era of abolition. However, but what we know very well, you know, those who study other colonial territories and other colonial spheres, the persistence of the slave trade and slavery goes long beyond those dates, and the legacies of the slavery are still present in our society. So in a way, this mythology of the era of the abolition was kind of like a very nice conclusion and a very literary way of putting an end to this historical process, but in reality, quite problematic and quite difficult to digest, especially when we look at places like Cuba and Brazil, where the 19th century is the era of the slave trade and slavery. So nothing close to an era of abolition. So having the chance of looking specifically into this for a whole block of the module, I think is, you know, I'm really excited about it, and hopefully my students will be as well. So really looking forward to really engage with the notion of abolition and emancipation, not as a historical point in a timeline, not as an episode, but actually as a process that, you know, hopefully we will all conclude together that hasn't finished. And I think that you know, recent events, for example, what happened in Bristol not long ago, really tells a story that the legacies of the slavery and the slave trade and the history of emancipation hasn't concluded.
Charlotte, do you want to tell us about your contribution to this module?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose to pick up on what Jenny was saying about resistance, I think I think it's important that on this module that we've got this focus on those who were enslaved, and not just on white slave owners and abolitionists. And you know, the idea is that hopefully we're telling a fuller story. And what I've been teaching so far is we started off actually studying Evelyn Trouillot's an infamous Rosalie, which it's a novel which tells the everyday stories of individuals living through slavery in pre-revolutionary Haiti. And we were thinking about what daily life, everyday life was like for enslaved men and women. So I think what's important is there's this focus on the human and themes of language, identity, racial, gender identity, and movement and migration that really speak to undergraduate studying languages. And I kind of, just to go back to the kind of transnational, what I'd like to see come out of this module actually is that that we all start to work together, and this module actually feeds into our research. We were talking about this the other day about how, you know, we should be making these connections between Brazil and Haiti, Cuba and Haiti, Brazil, Japan and Haiti, thinking, Roussel, about your incredible work on representations of the Haitian Revolution in 19th century children's magazines, right, in Japan, to make these connections, find these new narratives that can contribute to ongoing processes of decolonization, and that blur the organization of HE languages departments into these silos that are largely based on colonial languages and colonial disciplinary lines. Although I guess what I had to say, one thing that maybe one shortcoming of this module is that it's taught in English. Although hopefully in the second semester we're going to study some poetry written and performed in Haitian Creole, and I think we're all sensitive to language as a form of domination, but also as a form of resistance. Yeah.
Yeah, I've looked at the syllabus and it's fascinating. I wish I could be one of your students. Just a reminder to everyone listening out there, watching out there, you are able to engage in this conversation by using the Q&A or by raising your hand. You're welcome to ask questions verbally. There's perhaps some things that we haven't expanded on that you'd like to know more about. So please do use the Q&A function. There is one in the question in the chat, and it's about finding Spanish texts about slavery. So this is from someone who wants to find, I'm looking to translate this sort of text for my MA, something about Spanish texts about slavery. You're welcome to ask more about this if you want, but I don't know if there's anything any of the panelists might be able to say on that.
There is some really interesting text that you can look into. So, you know, from the early abolitionist speeches and discourses. So you got, for example, the Bosquejo del Comercio de Esclavos by Jose Maria Blanco White. You also got, you know, various parliamentary speeches. So perhaps the most iconic one is the 1810, I think it's the 2nd of April of 1810, speech by Agustín de Argüelles in the courts of Cádiz. You know, the first political attempt to put an end to the slave trade in the Spanish crown. I also wrote down, you know, you got examples of the other kind of side of the argument. So you got this very prolific author, Jose Antonio Sacco, a white supremacist activist who's writing from Cuba, and you know, who's kind of the author of this thesis of the need to whiten the island, of stopping the slave trade as a way of preserving Cuba as a white territory. And then, of course, you know, if you want to do something a bit more challenging, you can do a poetry translation, and Concepción Arenal, you know, who's an excellent poet of the Spanish 19th century urban tradition, and she wrote a few poems on the need to put an end to slavery. So a very iconic author.
I think we have a response to that in the chat. So yeah, a wide range of text still, yeah, that you can consult.
Poetry can be challenging.
And you also mentioned, Charlotte, some Creole poetry as well that you might be looking, well, you will be looking at hopefully in the module. Okay, I'm quite mindful of time, so I would like to move on to speak about really exciting projects that you are working on. It's the Anti-Slavery Arts and Heritage Network. Please tell us what this is and what sort of plans you have for it.
Okay, thanks, Rizal. So it started out, I guess, because some funding was made available by the Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences College for international initiatives. And actually, I've been speaking with Jenny, and we knew that Jesús was about to join the School of Modern Languages. And we talked about setting up a very small scale reading group kind of affair. But actually a colleague suggested that we should try applying for this international initiatives fund. So it kind of went from being very sort of minor, small thing to an international network. But anyway, the idea of the network was that it would promote international exchange between researchers with expertise in historical slavery, 21st century forms of modern slavery and labour exploitation, and resistance to these labour regimes through the arts. And one of the original aims of the network was to think about how histories of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade have a bearing on discourses of human trafficking and modern slavery. The historical and contemporary forms tend to be studied separately. So we're honoured to include the following international partners, some of whom might actually be on the call. So firstly, the University Cher Anta Diop in Dhaka, with whom actually the School of Modern Languages was working with already on an online exchange programme between undergraduate students in Senegal and in Wales. So it's kind of building on that partnership. So Eileen Dem and Abdoulaye Touré in history and historical archaeology. You've worked on the Ile de Gorée and the replica slave ship, and history textbooks and school education. Serine Sai and Mamadou Dramé, who are interested in representations of transatlantic slavery and descent-based slavery in Senegalese hip-hop and literature. Also at the University of Coimbra, colleagues at the Centre for Social Studies, so Cristiano Gianola, who are currently working on the EU Horizon Echoes project, so Gianola's looking at colonial heritage in Lisbon, and Giuseppina Raggi in art history at Coimbra as well, who kind of put us in touch with a colleague at Federal University of Rio, Marcia Chuba, who's working in museum and heritage policies in Brazil. Also colleagues at the University of Bremen in the Institute for Post-Colonial and Transcultural Studies, as well as colleagues across Cardiff, Cardiff University, but also University of South Wales. And I think, Jenny, you're possibly, you had a trip planned and you were going to be going to the University of Campinas.
Yes.
Yeah, so that, that was also a potential link. And Jesús, I know you've got links with the International Slavery Museum, Liverpool. So yeah, I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but I guess the update is that the funding, because of COVID, has been removed or halted, I think, for the time being. But what I can say is I think this could be an opportunity to think about more equitable ways of collaborating between colleagues based in the Global North and colleagues in the Global South. And I'm thinking about Ambrina Manji's inaugural lecture for the language-based area studies language-based area studies research group last week. And I think the increased use of online conferencing could be really helpful here. I remember when we first started talking about a possible event back in 2019, myself and Jenny, I remember Jenny mentioning that we talked a little bit about online platforms, and she mentioned that she'd taken part in a Zoom conference, and I was like, wow, this is amazing. And now we're all completely zoomed out.
How things change.
So, yeah. So I think we could capitalize on the current situation. But I don't know if Jesús and Jenny want to feed into any of that, or if I've missed anything.
I think that, following on your last comment, I think that, this has really, or the pandemic has really changed the way that we think about collaboration and interaction with colleagues around the globe. Like, I think that it has had really negative consequences in terms of access to archives and primary sources research. And I think that I haven't spoken to anyone who has given me like a practical solution to overcome those issues. So, fingers crossed for that vaccine, not just for our research, but for everyone's health. But I think that in terms of collaboration and as a waking up call, in terms of being able to talk to people and organize events with people with very limited funding and almost immediately, I think that it has been a very positive experience. I've recently started organizing a forum on Black soldiers in the Caribbean with colleagues from all around the Atlantic world. And only a few months ago that would have required enormous amounts of money and a lot of like logistical preparation, visas, and a lot of work. And this was just like a 5-minute setup, a link process. So I think that in that sense, I think that we've all changed the way we think about collaborative work and event organizing.
Mm-hmm. And I think in that respect as well, it's easier to just jump in and see the kinds of conversations that are going on in different parts of the world, in different parts of that we might not necessarily be connected to, and conferences and events and seminars are automatically online, and we have much more access than we've had in the past. I think it's opening up that possibility, as you say, for more collaboration between the global south and north.
I would like to ask a question that's come through on the Q&A. Perhaps this relates to the Arts and Heritage Network, because it's a question about sources and the inclusion of enslaved African voices. So I'll read it. What are some non-text sources that you are using to include enslaved African voices and perspectives? So this relates to Spain, but perhaps Jenny and Charlotte, you can mention in your context as well. So Jesús, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. So
address that?
For my own research, I have mainly worked with a combination. So there are two fundamental sources, non-textual sources, to look into African, resistance and African voices in the process of abolition and emancipation. So on the one hand, you have oral history, and I would love to recommend everyone a documentary. It's available online, and it's called "They Are We," that tells the story of a group of Cuban. Of Cuban Black Cubans from the city of Perico, who connect with a group of Africans in what is today Sierra Leone, and they discuss how rooted and how important oral history has been in the way that they think about themselves and the way that they remember and think about the slave trade. I see that Manuel has just posted the link on the chat, so there you go. Thank you, Manuel. So oral history is a very useful way of identifying forms of resistance among the African communities in Cuba and across the Caribbean. And more recently, I've been very interested also in reading, because I'm not an expert, but in reading quite a lot about archaeological research. So there's been some quite fascinating archaeological studies. The ones that I've read are mainly for the south of the United States, but I know there are some good examples for the Caribbean region as well, of archaeological sites in plantations and other key archaeological sites. But yes, I think that we will all agree that there is a lot more to be done in this area, and that we need to build histories of slavery and the slave trade that don't neglect African voices.
Thank you. There's some interesting discussion in the chat. Something from Tillman, if it's okay, it's just gone to the panelists, but if it's okay, I'll put that in the chat for all attendees. So some other forms of oral testimony there. Yep. Charlotte, Jenny, any word on non-text sources?
I guess I don't. So was the question? Yeah, just not to talk about my well, I guess one thing we could think about in terms of the network is to think about outputs differently, and multilingual outputs, and you know, whether we want to be, what kind of publications we want to be publishing in, or what kind of events, or what kind of, I guess that's something that could be rethought to be more inclusive as well. And in my research, I guess I'm doing a more ethnographic research now, but I think it's drawing on oral history, and even kind of looking at sort of textile methods and tools and techniques that have been passed down. I'm kind of interested in those crafting processes and what they can tell us. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's, I think, well, yeah, that question is certainly sort of, brought up some ways about how we produce research and who we speak to with our research, and I think you've really addressed that with your response. We were hoping to keep this relatively short and sweet, and didn't want to, you know, encourage any Zoom fatigue. So we'll start to wrap things up, and I'll do so with a question kindly submitted from the floor. And this is for Jesús. I'll read it out. You mentioned you are looking at the role of Black Caribbean soldiers. These soldiers have often not been acknowledged throughout core British history. Would you endorse people wearing black poppies instead of red in an attempt to acknowledge this gap and emphasize remembrance of all lives lost? So yeah, this is more about your opinion of poppies, I guess.
I'm not an expert, and I have to say that, you know, I started learning about the tradition to wear poppies when I moved to this country, so 7 years ago. So by no means I'm an expert. I was very surprised, and I remember being very surprised because, you know, I come from a family of very proud anti-fascist and anti-Nazi resistance. So I was kind of like happily surprised to see how many people were wearing what I thought was a symbol against fascism and in you know, as a way of honoring those who fought and died for freedom and liberty across Europe and across the world. So if we read the red poppy in that progressive and comprehensive way, I'm a big supporter of that view. But I'm more than aware that, you know, it has become in recent years also a symbol of division, and for many people a very conservative symbol and representation of that conflict. So any additional symbols that spark a conversation and open up the debate and reclaim the important role that Black soldiers and Black people in general played during the Second World War and the First World War, I think that's fundamental. But let's not forget that, you know, all these symbols, very often they talk about ourselves more than they talk about the conflict or the history itself. So not because you're going to wear a red poppy or a black poppy, it means that you have a better understanding of the conflict itself. So it's usually more an interrogation about who we are as a society. So, you know, whatever you wear, try to do your research first.
Great, and so on 11th November, I guess that's one way to close our discussion. Unless, of course, you have any final comments that you'd like to share with our attendees.
Just to say thank you very much, Roselle.
Thank you.
Oh, no, no, thank you.
Rochelle.
Thank you. I'm really pleased that we were able to do this, and yeah, I just find your research fascinating, and this module I think is a really strong example of research-led teaching, also of collaborative teaching, transnational teaching, and I'm really excited about what Charlotte said about how your research might be informed by your experience of teaching this module. I'd also like to thank all of the attendees. You've asked questions and also contributed in the chat. I'd like to encourage you to keep an eye on the MLang events page, and if you are external to the school, to also sign up to the MLang events mailing list. And through that, you'll see what future events we have, not just in the history and heritage research theme, but in the other research themes, which are doing really exciting stuff this year. So thank you once again, and I look forward to seeing everyone again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
I need to figure out how to stop this now. Okay, there we go.